Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well today. This time we are going to be talking about the Joe Montana football series. If you told me a few years ago that I would be tracking down a bunch of obscure football video games, I probably would have thought that you were crazy because I wasn't going for a complete set, and that would really be the only reason I would want to collect all of the Joe Montana football and then eventually NFL games for the Sega Genesis. However, that was kind of the situation I found myself in as I came up with this fun idea for a topic to cover. I wasn't expecting Sega to have made things so incredibly confusing for me, but they probably weren't thinking about some jackass on YouTube creating a video about this. The name of this series has changed at least 5 times, and I'm being serious about that, so we'll just run through all the games that they had really quick. It started with Joe Montana Football, and then the second one was Joe Montana Football 2 Sports Talk Football, or Sports Talk Football Joe Montana 2. The label is kind of confusing, and I've seen it written about 3 or 4 different ways, so these are the 2 that I found the most common. Then you have Sports Talk Football 93, starring Joe Montana, then NFL Football 94, starring Joe Montana, and then NFL 95, which Wikipedia says is the 6th game in the series, and I'm not sure how or why they did that, because it's the 5th, but whatever. Then you have Primetime Football 96, starring Deion Sanders, because they did not have a license to use Joe Montana anymore as their spokesman. And then they had NFL 97, and that's because they didn't have the rights to use Deion Sanders anymore. And then you have another weird one, which is NFL 98, but I've also seen it as NFL Primetime 98. And then that was the last one in the series, and they would move on to the 2K Sports Series. There wasn't just the licensing changes and the name changes with this. You also had 3 different developers work on this. You originally had Park Place, then you had Blue Sky, and then finally Farsight Technologies. And then there was the lawsuit that Joe Montana filed against Sega for breach of contract. It was filed in '97, and Joe Montana was seeking $5 million in compensation for it. I'll get more into the lawsuit once we've gone through all the games. This series is pretty notable because it did kind of pave the way for other sports games on the Sega Genesis, and also for the 2K sports games later on. The Sega Genesis really excelled at sports games. Most of them were better than their Super Nintendo counterparts, and it's just one of those things that helped Sega kind of stand out from the crowd, and it also brought in a somewhat older audience and a little bit, more mature. They weren't targeting the same group of people that Nintendo was, even if they did get some overlap, just because they had more mature games on the system. So let's talk a little bit more about these games, how the series got started, and kind of the direction that it was going in. Before the Joe Montana series, Sega had produced 2 games based on American football. In 1987, Sega produced Great Football for the Sega Master System, and in 1989 they made Walter Payton Football, which was also for the Master System. However, Sega of America didn't have the time or really the resources to create Joe Montana Football, at least in-house. And they were still rebuilding their development studios from one of their many frequent shutdowns, because that's kind of the history of Sega of America in the 80s. After reading several books on Sega of America's history, there was this trend of kind of building everything up and building a development pipeline, and then shutting it down as the industry changed. It's a series of just starts and stops. Ken Horowitz's book, The Sega Arcade Revolution and Playing at the Next Level, They help to kind of explain this part of Sega's history. Sega wanted to get a football game to market in Christmas of 1990. However, the first people that they went to was Activision, and Activision basically lied to Sega about the game's development, and this forced Sega to look for an alternative. This led them to kind of push the game back to January of 1991. EA was working on the latest edition of Madden at this time. The same company would end up making both that year's John Madden Football and also Joe Montana Football. But Joe Montana's game, it was going to be a little bit different. It had fewer teams in it, there were fewer plays, and it was more of an arcade style as opposed to a realistic simulation of football. Park Place Productions made the first game in the series. It didn't have the license from the NFL or the NFL's Players Association. This meant that they couldn't use team logos, they couldn't use the team names, they couldn't have players aside from Joe Montana in the game. So, yeah, it would look a little bit different and it would feel kind of strange, especially today if you go back and play it. It's very similar to the first Tecmo Bowl, where they just have cities and then the appropriate color schemes for the teams. I'm really not a fan of this game. I like what they were going for, but on the 8 and 16-bit systems, I don't like this perspective, and I just don't really enjoy this as much as the Tecmo Bowl games. After this game, Park Place would not work on the series anymore, and the development would shift to Blue Sky Software. They would end up being the developers for Joe Montana 2 and all the way up through NFL 95. Blue Sky was founded in 1989 and was in business up until 2001. They developed games for various home consoles and handheld consoles, as well as some personal computers. Blue Sky's first entry in the series was kind of an interesting looking one. It, in many ways, looked like the Tecmo Bowl games, but it still tried to be more realistic. It plays similar to the PS1 version of Tecmo Super Bowl, which I hated. It's not that great. And this one has a lot of weirdness to it that I really don't like either. It's kind of a strange mix of arcade and realistic football, resulting in something that I don't feel really works all that well. Some of the strange things in it that kind of sound cool at the time, but I found more annoying than anything, was the zooming in on plays. So you'll start with this kind of pulled out perspective, and then once you hand the ball off, the screen will zoom in. Or when you throw the ball, the screen will zoom in to the person who's going to be catching it. It's just kind of really jarring, and I honestly hate it quite a bit. The passing system would also be just a major pain in the ass for most of these games. I often had no idea who the hell I was throwing the ball to, and more often than not, it resulted in an interception. It wasn't just me, though. The computer was also just having a horrible time with it. It seemed really strange that just the defense was so much better than the offense on this game, and really on a lot of the Blue Sky games. So now we move on to the third game and another name change. We have Sports Talk Football 93 starring Joe Montana. I think it looks like a graphical upgrade from the previous game, but it plays very much the same, and it's really not that much better than the previous one. Both games make it really painful to play on offense. I'm not sure what is happening with them, but the defense is just so much tougher than the other ones. Like I mentioned before, passing the football is hard. In this game, it feels like you're playing Russian roulette. The only difference is there's only one empty chamber and 5 loaded. It's really bad. I didn't experience this with Joe Montana 2, but with Sports Talk Football 93, things just kind of happen. Like, you'll be running down the field, the opponent will bounce into you, and all of a sudden the opponent has the football. It's obviously a fumble, but it kind of feels like you handed the ball off to the other team, and it's weird. This happened for me more than it happened against me, but it was just very strange to all of a sudden, now you're running with the football, and you don't really know why. You didn't see the ball bounce on the ground, but just all of a sudden now you have it. So, sure. I guess that works out. One thing I did notice that was just kind of bizarre, it was really effortless to just return punts and kickoffs for touchdowns. This was kind of bizarre to see, and it would be a theme running for a lot of the Blue Sky games. It was just really easy to return these things for touchdowns. That was not the case with something like Tecmo Football, which really still is the best comparison for this game. These first two games by Blue Sky would be the only ones that use this side view. It was completely abandoned after this, and I think that's probably for the better. They would still have some of the zooming stuff going on, which still sucked, but they would get rid of this and move closer towards Madden Football. The next game would just be another name change, and honestly, kind of a step back in some ways. This is NFL Football 94 starring Joe Montana. This would return to the same style that was used in the first game and the Madden Football games. And I honestly feel like the graphics have gotten a little bit worse. They changed perspectives, but I think it was more detailed and just better looking with the last game, but it would get better with the next one. Just like the previous games, you still zoom in whenever you catch or run the ball, and it's still pretty jarring to see. I don't know, maybe it sounded cool, but I don't think it really helps with the gameplay at all. I would almost rather have it just stay zoomed out or something like that. Or at least have a smoother zoom, because this one, it just sort of hits like a stop, and then it zooms in, and then you start playing again, and it just kind of feels a little crappy. This game kind of was moving more towards being like a television broadcast. While the other games in the series also attempt this, I feel like the developers did a better job with NFL Football 94 in this respect. I still think the defense is way too strong. It's just ridiculously strong for this game. Not as bad as the previous two, but it still feels like they have a huge advantage over you. And yeah, the passing game just got so much worse with this one, but it was somewhat easier to run. I don't know. I just really wish that they would have just stuck with one style instead of jumping between these, and I really wish they had gotten rid of the zooming stuff. NFL 95 is the last game in the series to feature Joe Montana on the cover. His name's not associated with it anymore, but he is still on the cover of the game. This would also be the last game that Blue Sky worked on. Around the time of this game, they were kind of trying to go through another licensing agreement with Joe Montana. His contract may have ended around this time, but I'm not really sure. But the contract was being renegotiated. Something happened, and then Sega parted ways with Montana. I'll talk more about the lawsuit at the end of this, but it's still kind of weird, and there's a lot of facts that I'm not totally sure on. I think NFL 95 looks the best out of the Blue Sky games. The zoom out mode from the previous games is completely gone, and it's replaced with a much smoother camera angle that is much less jarring than the one before. Now when you catch the ball, it's no longer just a zoom in box on something. It kind of eases you into it, and it just looks a lot better than the previous game's efforts to do this. The defense is still quite tough. Not as bad as some of the other games, but it's still pretty bad. Of the Blue Sky games, I would recommend this one, NFL 95. It's a pretty good game. It's closer to how Madden plays, and the passing system is still messed up, but it's been messed up the entire series, so you're just kind of playing with a broken toy that you expect to be broken. From here, the development team is going to shift over to Farsight Technologies. I wasn't exactly able to figure out why, but maybe that's for another video. After the split with Montana, Sega would go on to make 3 more games in this series before moving on to a different developer and starting the NFL 2K series. These were made by Farsight Studios, which was formerly known as Farsight Technologies. Farsight is still making games today, they just aren't really working with Sega as far as I can tell. They do have a long history of developing video games, and it's kind of cool to see that they're continuing to do so today. This game has a confusing name that I've kind of talked about earlier, but just to recap, the box says Primetime NFL starring Deion Sanders. However, there's also an alternate name out there of Primetime Football 96. Primetime would kind of be used for some of the later games, but it's not on their box cover, so it's kind of weird whenever you look at that. And it also makes it a real pain in the ass when you're doing research on these games, because stuff just either isn't there or it's under a different name. It makes things really confusing. Primetime Football 96 looks a lot like NFL 95, but I think it plays better than that game. Both games were better balanced than the previous ones in the series, and with this one, you don't have to struggle so much to gain yards on offense. It just felt like an easier game to play than the other ones. I haven't mentioned this yet, but the touchdown celebrations are getting more elaborate and, much better in my opinion. And it's kind of given the game a little bit more personality. The previous ones didn't have anything really spectacular. You just ran into the end zone, then you got a little cutscene. Here, you have your character kind of jump around and celebrate and be happy that they actually did something. It's pretty awesome, I think. And it kind of made this game more than like a simple celebration. It's something that I also like in the NFL Blitz games as well. There is one game on here that I was not able to find a copy of. That is NFL 97. It's the only game on here that I haven't played and I don't own, so I don't have any footage of it. It was an exclusive on the Sega Saturn, and to be fair, I wasn't really motivated to start collecting games for the Sega Saturn, so I didn't want to buy the system and then buy the game and then sit down and play it. It was just kind of beyond the scope of what I wanted to do. Based on the reviews for that game, it's not very good. I'm not sure why it was the only one released on the Sega Saturn, and it wasn't ported to the Sega Genesis or anything else. And it was one of the exclusive games for the North American market. And the Saturn really wasn't all that popular here to warrant that, but I don't know. It's baffling to me that actually happened, but many of the things that Sega of America did at that time and Sega of Japan did were really confusing. The most common name used for the last game in the series is NFL 98. And you have no idea how happy I am that they stopped changing the name so often. It made looking stuff up on this game so much easier. By this point, many of the problems in the other games are pretty much gone. The zoom-in feature has long been removed. It makes the game so much easier to play without it. You've got more formations in this game. It's easier to tell what you're doing, and it's just a more user-friendly game than a lot of the previous ones. Sometimes, and I should have mentioned this with a few of the Blue Sky games, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I had no idea what play I was supposed to be running. I just sort of assumed that I was doing a run play. There were times, I believe in NFL 94, or whatever the hell they changed the name to, that I thought I was picking a pass play, or I thought I was picking a run play, and all of a sudden my quarterback's doing something totally different than what I was anticipating. It was kind of shit, but at least I could figure out what was happening. Here with NFL 98, I don't have any of those problems. The Farsight games overall look better than the Blue Sky games, and yeah, this was late in the Genesis lifespan, so you have the developers that really know the system, and they know how to get the most out of it. The 96 and 98 games, they look really good, and they kind of resemble the Madden games from this era for the most part. I say for the most part because Madden has moved on to the 32 and 64-bit systems at this point, so those are probably going to be what people are looking at the most. They're on more successful systems, and they're just going to look a lot better than what the Genesis could do. The two series by this point pretty much are going to play the same, at least in my opinion. They're not going to be too different, and yeah, that's kind of what you would expect. The button layouts might be a little bit different, but you're not going to be doing anything too crazy. After this, Sega would move development to a different studio and begin working on the 2K Sports franchises. These would initially be released on the Dreamcast, but once that system got discontinued, the games would start appearing on other consoles. And I think we're kind of better off for it, because it made just more competition for the EA games and everything like that, with the exception of the NFL games, which got discontinued in 2004. With the series pretty much out of the way here, let's talk about this kind of weird lawsuit that happened and some of my frustrations with finding information on it. Most of the information on this is going to be coming from different news articles. I could not find a copy of the actual lawsuit, which is kind of understandable. In July 1997, several newspapers reported on the lawsuit between Joe Montana and Sega of America. According to the articles that I've read, Montana was supposed to receive a percentage of the game's sales, but Sega told him that the contract was void and they were not going to pay him. This was the result of an attempt to negotiate a contract extension, but that fell through. Sega said they're not going to pay him anymore, and the two were, according to Sega, were supposed to part ways. Montana didn't necessarily see that the same way, so he filed a lawsuit against them, seeking $5 million in damages. And yeah, that was pretty much all the information I could find on it. But yeah, it's kind of weird that the articles didn't have a whole lot, and I couldn't really find any results on the conclusion of this. We know that negotiations occurred in 1995 when Montana's name was removed from the games. This is a little strange for the timeline because the papers are reporting in July of 97 that this was going to happen, but NFL 95 had already removed his name from the box art. They did keep a picture of him when he was playing for the Kansas City Chiefs, but he's not mentioned as like a featured player in the game anymore. I really wish that there was more information on this lawsuit, but I just couldn't really find it. The only thing that I could find was what Montana was looking for and a little bit of why things were happening, as well as that the contract negotiations broke down. It's understandable that I couldn't, because if the lawsuit was settled out of court, we're not going to know about that, and I couldn't find any reporting on that. So yeah, we're just kind of left with this one, that the lawsuit took place, and everything was kind of kept private after that. It is a little anticlimactic, but that's really all the information that I could find out there. If there is an update on this, I'll probably put that out as another video. I'm not really sure why I found this series so interesting. It could be that it was almost constantly in flux with changes to its name, changes to the feature player on it, and also just a long history of trying to be Madden, but also trying to be a little bit different, at least from the way the games looked and the way the games played. The game's origin is kind of cool. It's just a watered-down version of that year's Madden, and it's kind of a fun footnote in Sega's history. This was kind of a confusing series to gain some information on. It was really overshadowed by the more successful John Madden Football series, as well as a lot of the one-off football games from this era, many of which are better than Joe Montana Football and some of the other games in this series. It felt like they were really trying to be what Tecmo Super Bowl was, which was a competitor to Madden with a different play style and that sort of thing. But slowly they just morphed into what's essentially a clone of John Madden Football. I really do wish that there had been more information on the lawsuit. That's the only thing in this entire series that really got me excited to do more research on this, but it just sort of ended very anticlimactically. Anyway, that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on the series and honestly just football games in general. I will talk to you all later. Bye.